Today on the podcast, we're going to finish our 10-part story of Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and how the Disney company transformed itself from a modest animation studio into a major Hollywood operation. And as we close up this story, there are a couple of surprises along the way, a few elements that I'm guessing most of our listeners won't see coming. When we left off last time, Walt and Watkin had just returned from the Dublin premiere of Darby O'Gill, only to find that Hollywood writers were moving toward a strike. Walt had offered Watkin a position as a producer, a position that would have saved him from the strike. But Watkin, much to Walt's surprise, turned him down, claiming that he only wanted to be a writer and that he didn't want to work again on the business side of production. And so now, without delay, let's jump back into our story and find out how all of this ends. The strike was long and difficult. It lasted 148 days from January 16th through June 12th, crippling Hollywood for nearly half a year. During these months, Walt began to drift away from movies. His attention was focused more on his amusement park in Anaheim, in proposing attractions that he might build through WED for the New York World's Fair, and in plans for a new resort somewhere on the East Coast, perhaps just north of Miami. When the strike was over, Walt called Watkin in for a meeting, as presumably all striking workers were now returning to their old jobs. But Watkin knew immediately that he was being dismissed. By now it was clear that Walt was trying to shift live-action production over to a set of surrogates, so that his time might be freed up for other projects, likely related to the expansion of his theme parks. His hand-picked surrogates included producers such as Bill Anderson and Bill Walsh, as well as directors such as Ken Anakin and Robert Stevenson. In this model, writers would work project to project, which was similar to the current arrangement at other studios. Months earlier, Walt had offered Watkin a seat at this table, alongside Anderson and Anakin, but Watkin, much to Walt's surprise, had turned him down. Now, in the summer of 1960, Walt invited him graciously into his office, as he often did when he expected a difficult conversation to follow. "We just don't have anything for you to do," Walt said. He complimented Watkin's work at the studio, particularly the last two British pictures, but in Watkin's estimation, his old boss appeared embarrassed, especially as they had worked together for over a decade. He also thought that Walt was still upset because I had refused to be a producer. There were things that, in defending himself, Watkin might have brought up. How he'd never received meaningful royalties from Spin and Marty, even though it had been a big hit for Disney. How he'd worked like a dog to make some of Walt's unusual picks, such as The Sword and the Rose, work for the screen. And how once, according to his secretary, Walt had said that Darby O'Gill had been the best script he had read in 30 years. But Watkin simply remained quiet. "I looked at him all the way through the conference," he recalled, "but he never looked at me." Walt likely expected Watkin to put up a fight, to insist that there was honor in defending his role at the studio solely within writing, which was clearly his area of strength. A small argument would make this whole process move forward, with each person believing that they were somehow in the right, Watkin wanting only to be a writer, and Walt wanting high-level creative people who moved easily between needed roles. But Watkin believed that his best defense was no defense, allowing Walt to see that he was vulnerable. When it became clear that Watkin wasn't going to put up a fight, Walt softened his tone, like he did in the old days, and said, "I'm sure you'll make just as much money as a freelance writer as you will working for me." Watkin only nodded his head without answering. Unsure of what to do or how to end the conversation gracefully, Walt picked up a script and began to read it, signaling that Watkin probably should leave, thereby concluding one of the most successful collaborations Walt had experienced with anyone outside of his top circle of animators. The tragedy in Walt's life, as far as Watkin was concerned, was that Walt lost the joy found in creating a film. Walt used to say to me, "Don't grow up, Larry." He said the same thing to others. But then, at least as Watkin saw it, he grew up and started to view the studio more as a place of business than as a place of play. That night, Watkin told his wife that he had been let go. "But you've worked so hard," she said. "I thought he was our friend." Still upset, Watkin replied, "He's incapable of friendship, and I think there are only 3 things he loves: his 2 daughters and that goddamn studio." His wife suggested that Disneyland and the park he was considering in the Miami area might be lumped into that list. "Those are his playthings," Watkin corrected. In the years after Watkin left the studio, Walt became interested in city planning, a serious topic, with his ambition set on building Epcot the City, an experimental municipality to be arranged on a massive tract of land that he had purchased in Florida. Instead of pirates and leprechauns, Walt was focused on the problems of transportation, renewable energy, efficient trash removal, well-designed housing units, and public green spaces. At the studio, some of Walt's closest associates saw Epcot as a sign of maturity in their boss, a desire to solve social problems and create a better society. Watkin saw it as a personal failure, a confirmation that Walt had, in fact, grown up and had forgotten about those areas where he truly excelled. For a while, a resentment followed Watkin, a sense that he had been wronged, that Walt hadn't honored all of the work he had given to the studio. As a freelancer, he wrote for TV, including for the shows The Virginian and National Velvet, only to find he didn't much care for the medium. He also didn't like the isolation of being a solo writer, even though that was how he had started his career. After years of collaboration at the Disney studio, he missed the company of fellow filmmakers. He quickly tired of freelancing and returned to teaching, where again he was surrounded by colleagues, although on campus his fellow teachers were mostly scholars, not artists. "A writer can be happy in his study," Watkin explained, "but once he has been spoiled by life at a studio or a college, he misses not only the companionship of kindred souls, but the walking dictionaries." After 19 years of working for various studios, including 13 years at Disney, he took a job at CSU Fullerton, where he taught novel writing, short story writing, and screenwriting. He made less as a teacher than as a scriptwriter, but that didn't matter now. He had money, most of which he had earned from Disney and from a house near Hollywood he had bought and then sold for a tremendous profit. From a distance, he kept an eye on the Disney studio. Treasure Island made its way to TV in 1962 as a 2-part episode for the weekly Disney TV series, and Darby O'Gill was put back into theaters in 1965. For its re-release, the studio redubbed a few sections of dialogue, removing lines where actors presented a heavy brogue accent, and replacing them with largely the same lines offered with more standardized pronunciations. This, the studio believed, would be easier for most children to understand and would hopefully increase ticket sales at the box office. Beyond the old films, Watkin saw that many Disney projects were moving in new directions. The studio was now focused on comedies such as The Absent-Minded Professor and The Misadventures of Merlin Jones, as well as contemporary adventures featuring young people, such as The Parent Trap and Almost Angels. In large part, the studio had moved on from historical dramas, which had been Watkin's specialty. But Watkin saw his lingering influence in a few projects. Darby O'Gill, for example, had set up later Disney fantasy films that incorporated music, including Babes in Toyland and Mary Poppins. Though Watkin didn't return to the studio, he followed Walt's life by reading articles in magazines and in the newspaper, including how Walt planned to build a resort in Central Florida, also a ski resort in California. In the fall of 1966, Watkin read that Walt was in the hospital. The article, almost surely cribbed from an official studio press release, underplayed the seriousness of Walt's condition. Walt had lung cancer, though the studio and nearly all media outlets initially claimed that Walt was undergoing surgery for an old injury he had sustained while playing polo. Even after doctors removed cancer, the Disney family kept this information private as a personal matter, though most longtime employees at the studio could see that Walt was very ill. By this point, Watkin was over any irritation he'd initially felt when leaving the studio. Moreover, he still felt a shadow closeness with his old boss, as he both liked Walt and understood that his efforts at Disney would likely be the centerpiece of his career. I sent him a get well message the moment the newspapers told of his hospitalization, Watkin explained, but I don't think it ever reached him. A few weeks later, Watkin learned that Walt had died. At one point back in the 1950s, Walt had speculated about his own death with Watkin, who asked if Walt ever planned to retire. Retire, Walt had said. I could have retired 30 years ago. I want to die right in harness. But the image Watkin had of Walt during his final days, stuck in a hospital room across the street from the studio, didn't feel like dying in harness. It felt more like dying after a month or two of convalescence. With this, Watkin felt a sorrow come down around him, as he understood with finality that this large chapter in his own life was now over. 3 years later, in 1969, Watkin considered retirement, packing up all of his writing and teaching gear to focus on his family and his growing number of grandchildren. He took stock of his various pension funds, from the universities and from his work as a writer. The Writers Guild told him that if he wrote one more script, he would move from 19 years credit to 20, which qualified him for a 20-year pension, something that would help support him and his wife in their final years. With this, he wrote his old friend, Bill Anderson, at the Disney studio. He explained the sadness he had felt at Walt's passing, also that he was now looking into retirement himself. Then he explained that he was in need of writing one more script to complete 20 years of work for a guild pension. Anderson, who had been fond of Watkin, sent him a 10-page story written by James Street called The Biscuit Eater, the tale of two boys and a wayward dog. As it was set in Georgia in the 1940s, Watkin believed that he could use his familiarity with the South, having lived in Virginia in the 1940s, to create a believable and realistic script. The story was a natural for me, Watkin said. I had a notebook full of Southernisms I had never used, and I wrote a script I knew was good. For the first time in years, he spent a little time at the studio, where he talked with old friends. And then something unusual began to happen. He started to dream somewhat regularly about Walt, as though Walt were still alive, still directing Watkin's work toward the screen. At night, as he moved into sleep, he occasionally found Walt rising up, mustache and all, from the mist of his dreams. At times, he discussed these dreams with old friends at the studio, only to discover that other longtime employees had them as well. I thought Walt was a tremendously interesting man, Watkin said, whose personality was so strong that he still dominated my dreams, and I discovered that many others still dreamed about him as I often did. As Anderson put The Biscuit Eater into production, he asked Watkin if he might be interested in working on another project for the studio, something on which the two of them might work together. Watkin proposed a project that he had considered for a while. During the filming of I Captured the King of the Leprechauns, the promotional TV episode for Darby O'Gill, Watkin became aware of how charismatic Walt was on camera. He knew that the studio had endless reels of film featuring Walt, also a stack of audio recordings of Walt and of people who worked with him. Watkin proposed creating a film biography of Walt, something that would reuse film of Walt and also feature those who knew him. It was a way to take Walt out of his dreams and to place him firmly on paper. Bill Anderson discussed the idea with Roy Disney. Roy didn't want a movie to present the life of his brother, but he and the family did want a written biography, something that might be more accurate and kinder than other recent book-length accounts, such as the Disney version by Richard Schickel, which had been penned shortly after Walt's death. Schickel, in writing an unofficial biography, didn't have access to company documents. Also, he wasn't able to interview many current studio employees, leaving him to rely on those who had left the company or were fired, particularly those who left during the deeply harmful Disney animation strike of 1941. Their perspective filled his books with negative stories about Walt. In Watkin's estimation, Schickel's book presented Walt as a money-grubbing Philistine who no longer had anything to say to people of taste and intelligence. Watkin was interested in this project. He wanted to create an official biography that would counter Schickel's book, a new biography for which Walt would interview those who had been close to Walt, also those who still worked for the studio. Watkin proposed writing a personal kind of biography, one in which he would be able to comment on Walt as an individual and include his own experience. To assist with this project, the company offered access to boxes of tapes, papers, and films that together held the essence of Walt. Watkin believed that he could produce a biography that mattered, one that elevated Walt as an artist. By then, the bitterness had been washed from Watkin's mouth. With distance, he could admit that his time with Walt formed one of the most important experiences in his life, even if it had ended poorly. In recent years, despite being essentially fired by Walt, Watkin found himself telling stories of the man, stories touched with notes of warmth, stories that at times he worked out into a mental list. There was the time that someone had called Walt an old son of a bitch. The following day, Walt said, "Hell, I've often been called a son of a bitch, but he had no right to call me old." Then there was the time that Walt whispered a secret to a known studio gossip to make sure all his employees would hear it. There was the time that Walt walked out of the Dorchester Hotel to find autograph hounds pressing in around him. As usual, he signed his name quickly. But then across a public square, a well-groomed area angled off with grass and raised flower beds, he saw that old matinee idol, Tyrone Power. Power, still good-looking, moved along the sidewalk with his short-clipped hair and high cheekbones, a man easing into his 40s. With pen in hand, Walt let his eyes slide from Power to the crowd, then to Power again, considering his options. Finally, he called out, "There's Tyrone Power. One autograph of his is worth 3 of mine." As the crowd moved across the square, Walt quietly walked toward a cab, sliding into the back seat with Watkin right behind. A book about Walt was a perfect assignment, as Watkin enjoyed research and also as he was looking for an opportunity to, in small ways, discuss his own time at the studio. For months, Watkin went through studio holdings, relying heavily on a multi-part set of interviews that journalist Pete Martin had done with Walt in 1956. Hours and hours of tape in which Walt explained his life from childhood up through Disneyland. 2 or 3 times a week, Watkin drove to the studio and took notes, which he then carried back to his house in Orange County, where he arranged them into chapters. During these months, he spent time with Roy, who filled in many gaps about the company's history that Watkin could not find in various interviews and documents. He interviewed dozens of artists who had worked at the Disney studio, including those involved in the 1941 animators' strike. In this strike section, he wanted to focus both on how Walt saw the strike as well as those who walked the picket lines saw it. For this, he decided to let artists talk about the event anonymously, hopefully to offer a more balanced account of what had happened. I had decided not to mention the name of the first striker I interviewed, Watkin said, or that of any other Disney employee. Still, the section was focused mostly on how Walt understood and overcame these challenges, even if it did give space to those on the other side of the picket line. In researching Walt's life, Watkin learned about his own, specifically how he fit into the company's plan. He talked to animators and other filmmakers. He also looked at plans Walt had created for various projects, including the resort in Florida. In 1959 and 1960, during Watkin's last year as a Disney screenwriter, Walt had been working with NBC, RCA, and insurance millionaire John D. MacArthur on a new Disney park and beach resort just north of Miami. These plans, after revision, would shift and expand a few years later without the beach element into Central Florida. In this, Watkin better understood what Walt had needed back then. Walt was not only trying to save Watkin's job by making him a producer, he was also looking to set up a group of individuals he could trust with live-action productions while he focused on some very complex projects that needed his direct attention. Watkin could see the cycle now. Animation needed Walt's attention for years. Then that focus was shifted in part to live action as lead animators took over the production of animated features. In 1960, Walt needed to shift his focus from live action to other projects by handing control of features over to those he had groomed for the roles. After researching Walt's plans for Disney World Florida, Watkin admitted, I felt almost ashamed of myself that I had not tried to be the producer he wanted me to be, if only to help him out. In Watkin's hands, the story of Walt became one of challenges and perseverance. In one early chapter, after Walt left Kansas City and came to Hollywood to work in the pictures, Watkin focused largely on the obstacles before him. Reminiscing about his early struggles, Watkin wrote, Walt was usually inclined to hark back to the Kansas City days, but the scramble for a place in the Hollywood sun was far more arduous and exhausting. It takes a tremendous ego never to doubt that you're going to reach the top, and an amazing resilience to snap back from the beating you get along the way. This written version of Walt's life also had a stronger focus on Roy than later published efforts, as Watkin repeatedly discussed the company's early years with Roy in his office. Roy read the earliest stuff I had written, Watkin recalled, and highly approved. Watkin felt that Roy would likely be his defender, allowing this fuller version of Walt, both the good and to a lesser extent the bad, stand as the official biography. Roy repeatedly approved of Watkin's writing style, in which he included his own opinion of Walt based on personal experience. But by the time Watkin finished the manuscript, Roy too had passed, which meant that he wasn't there to defend Watkin's efforts. In the last draft, Watkin presented Walt as a person with strengths and limitations, an individual who struggled to create a company. As Watkin was an academic, he included quotes from literary figures to frame the importance of Walt's experience, including brief lines from British poets Lord Byron and Edmund Spenser, as well as references to Freud in exploring a psychological portrait of Walt and his father. In Watkin's mind, he was able to justify these inclusions because it set Walt shoulder to shoulder with great minds of the Western intellectual tradition. Walt talked to brilliant men all over the world, Watkin observed, so now his biography would include them as reference points. But Watkin never let the abstract language of the Academy enter his manuscript. Walt, Watkin knew, didn't care for showy language. If a person used an unusual word in conversation, Walt would shoot back, "What's the matter? You swallowed the dictionary?" In this, Watkin's biography was conversational, even if he occasionally included the thoughts and sayings of great artists and philosophers to suggest that Walt was a modern-day version of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. To further personalize and humanize his account, Watkin offered first-person observations about Walt that placed Watkin in the story as well. For example, when explaining how Darby O'Gill had been developed, Watkin framed the section as an exchange between himself and Walt. Walt believed in frightening the audience, Watkin began. "When I was writing Darby O'Gill and the Little People, it was Walt who encouraged me to make much more of the Banshee, that harbinger of death who may be either friend of the family or malevolent demon, to give the film guts." Lastly, Watkin helped readers distinguish between Walt's best works such as Snow White or The Creation of Mickey Mouse, which he proclaimed as a smashing success, from projects he saw as less meaningful, such as the early Alice comedies, whose work he described, likely influenced by conversations with Roy, as 5 years of drudgery. In the end, he produced a manuscript that offered Walt as a full person, bristling with ambition and genius, faced with struggles, as observed by a person who had been both a friend and later an admirer. Watkin turned in the manuscript at the end of summer 1972, a little later than planned, as by then he was in declining health, suffering in particular from heart problems. The committee that read the pages, largely a group of Disney executives such as Card Walker and Don Tatum, decided that it wasn't quite the image they wanted to present of their founder. Perhaps it was too literary. Perhaps it went too far in humanizing Walt for their tastes. Perhaps it included too much of Watkin in its pages. Perhaps the first-person account made it seem that Walt had only recently passed, when for the company it might be more useful to present Walt as a great figure attached to the company's past, which then would allow more space for current executives to arrange their projects as they felt best. In response, Watkin offered to rework the sections where he wrote in first person. "I don't mind cutting myself out of it," he said, "though I think that in the personal part I make sure that Walt comes off best." He also offered to revise down the references to various writers, artists, and psychologists. "I may have gone overboard about such things," he said. He also said that he could shorten the manuscript so that it would appear as a less daunting read for a casual fan. Initially, Watkin hoped that the committee would offer suggestions for revision, even deep revision. If everything objectionable were removed, he said, there would still be a book there. But ultimately, the committee felt that Watkin's approach wasn't the one that the company needed at the moment, following the deaths of both Walt and Roy. They needed something around which the image of Walt could be solidified as founder as the company moved forward beyond him. The company decided to pay Watkin his contract fee for finishing the project. No one on the actual committee called Watkin. Instead, his old friend Bill Anderson reached out to explain that this version wasn't what the company wanted to present in an official biography. Anderson thought that Watkin deserved a personal call, as he understood how hard he had worked on the manuscript. "I didn't embarrass myself by asking what he thought of it," Watkin later said, "for I had always liked Bill and still do." After passing on Watkin's manuscript, the company looked to Hollywood columnist Bob Thomas to write another biography on Walt, hopefully one that this time would lead to publication. In his column and various newspaper articles, Thomas had written about Walt for decades. In the late 1950s, he had also written the book-length presentation of how animation had been developed, largely at the Disney studio. His style was far more plain and straightforward than Watkin's, which perhaps better served the studio's needs. His book, eventually called Walt Disney: An American Original, was released in 1976. But if nothing else, Watkin's work on the biography had been an opportunity for him to express gratitude for Walt and the studio, to arrange his thoughts on the man who had changed his life. It was a picture of a great man who now, years after Watkin had been fired from the studio, had slowly become clear in his mind. With the manuscript about Walt finished but abandoned, Watkin felt that he was truly retired. He sold his house in Orange County and moved to Stockton to be close to one of his daughters. He gave away furniture and excess china and settled into a condominium. He and his wife Dot spent hours with their grandchildren. They also felt that Stockton was close enough to drive to visit their other two children, one of whom was in Los Angeles, the other in Idaho. Watkin spent time every day walking, trying to manage through exercise and diet the heart troubles that had plagued him now for years. Even though he lived far from Los Angeles, Watkin still followed the Disney company. He didn't think much of that new crop of Disney executives, though he had good reason, as these were the people who had rejected his biography. In his mind, he compared the management style of Walt with that of new executives such as Card Walker and Don Tatum. Walt was a born gambler, always wanting to try something new, Watkin said. This new group always wants to play it safe. They tried to guess what Walt would do, and they always guessed wrong. He liked Stockton. He liked visiting with his grandchildren. He liked spending time with Dot. But in 1975, she had a stroke, which led to a series of hospitalizations. For 4 years, Watkin focused on her care until finally she passed on. Alone, Watkin traveled, but he found he was too old and too weak to truly enjoy it. He wrote a screenplay which he gave to an agent with whom he had once worked, though nothing came of it. The main point as he saw it was simply to write, as it focused his mind and calmed his emotions now that he was a widower. "Pounding the typewriter is a habit, and it keeps me occupied," he said. By this point, he had outlived many of his friends. At times he joked that the title of his first novel could now describe his life. He was now living on borrowed time. In his final years, Watkin would often mention Walt and talk about the old life at the studio, as though he now saw the full importance of this experience, the way movies he had worked on continued to touch millions of people around the world. He talked about these experiences with a small circle of friends, also with his 3 children and 11 grandchildren. He would reflect on his time with Disney when he'd been Walt's primary screenwriter for live-action projects. It had been the high point of his professional life, a series of projects that would extend far beyond his own time on Earth. Those films, along with his early books, were what he would leave behind as gifts to this world when he left it. Though Watkin didn't know this, Walt in his final years likely still thought fondly of Watkin as well. Though Walt was typically focused on projects in development and didn't much talk about those who had left the studio, in some way Watkin had earned a unique place in Walt's life and in the history of the studio. Shortly after his passing, the studio had commissioned an inventory of his office rooms on the third floor of the animation building as a way of preserving the space. A newly hired archivist, Dave Smith, cataloged each object that Walt displayed: small treasures, miniature figurines, and mini awards. Most of these items were books of personal interest, prestigious awards, beautiful keepsakes, or gifts from celebrities or government leaders. Very few came from other employees. In all, there were 2,265 objects, but among those he kept on display were 2 related to Larry Watkin, revealing that Walt thought enough of Watkin to display his materials in his office even after he had been fired. Item number 807 was a copy of the Dell paperback Watkin had written on Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and then at number 1311 was a copy of a book written in Spanish, a graphic history of Cervantes and of Don Quixote, which Watkin had signed for Walt as a gift. It was a reminder of a story that Walt loved, a story he had shared with Watkin, and one neither of them ultimately was able to wrestle into a usable script. These items also gave Watkin's legacy a small space in Walt's office, one that they continued to inhabit even after Walt was gone. Though Watkin lived until 1981, he likely didn't understand the larger importance of the role he had played in the development of the studio and of the Walt Disney Company. Many years later, after the passing of both Walt and Watkin, the Disney Company would find its screen identity largely focused in live-action productions, features that ranged from Marvel to Star Wars, from Who Framed Roger Rabbit to Enchanted, from Pirates of the Caribbean to a remake of Alice in Wonderland, from Endgame to Rogue One. But Watkin had been there at the start of this journey back in 1947, when he had been hired to write a script based on the Darby O'Gill stories. With that and with Treasure Island, Watkin and Walt slowly taught themselves how live action worked and how such films might reshape the Disney studio, a process that continued over decades until many years later. Disney evolved from a modest animation studio that experimented with live action to the highest grossing studio in the world, accounting for nearly a third of all tickets sold globally, a journey that began when a 46-year-old novelist arrived at the Disney studio shortly after the war to take a shot at an unusual story that Walt wanted to make about leprechauns. A film whose journey slowly changed the direction of the Disney studio and of the history of Hollywood. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least at this time, is to post up our monthly news and analysis episode next week about the recent doings at the Disney Company and with the Disney parks. We'll soon start a new series, but as we're at the end of the one about Larry Watkin and the early live-action films, I want to point out that on Bandcamp, there are 2 existing series that pick up roughly where this one leaves off. First, Becoming the Sherman Brothers explores Walt Disney's efforts with live action in the 1960s, shortly after Watkin leaves the studio. And second, an album called Technology, Television, and A Park in Palm Beach explores how Disney arranged live action for TV in the early 1960s and how these efforts led to a large fight with the ABC network and also to an opportunity to build Disneyland East just north of Miami. Both of these series pick up the story of the Disney Company in the early 1960s, right where this one leaves off. Lastly, as you know, we are an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you will find over 200 episodes and albums not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us over there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.